Welcome to our lecture on Plato and Socrates. This is going to be a way of getting into the dialogue called the apology, which is not our modern usage of the word. It's a legal defense of one's position against a charge that's being made. The apology is that given by Socrates when he's facing the capital charge, that is a charge that he could get the death penalty for, of being impious with regard to the traditional religion of Athens. So it's one of the most dramatic moments in the history of, in the history of the world actually, but certainly in the history of thought. We have the great martyr to truth in Socrates. And his execution in 399 by the democracy of Athens is a cautionary tale for how philosophy and democracy relate to each other. Socrates was born around 470 BC and was executed in 399. His chief, or his greatest disciple was Plato, who was born around 427. He would have fallen into the circle of Socrates, late teens, early 20s, and then after the death of Socrates, the progress of his career will go over, but he died around 347 BC. The question that this dialogue, written by Plato, representing the last self-defense of Socrates before the people of Athens, the apology of Socrates, This dialogue puts before us two of the greatest thinkers ever to have existed. And it also gets us to think about the question, is the truth worth dying for? And that's even more complicated a question than it might seem if one takes it seriously. What is the truth? What if the truth that one is dying for is something like, I don't have certainty about the truth, or what I know is that none of us knows as much as we think we know. I mean, is that a worthwhile thing to die for? And that's kind of the position Socrates is in. He was known as he thought of himself as a gadfly to the populace of Athens. He was stinging them out of their complacency. He would go around and disturb the self-estimation of a person, which is our natural position to think, I've got a pretty good handle on reality. I think I know what's going on. And here Socrates would come in the agora, which is the central public meeting space, the marketplace, the place where the citizens gathered in the ancient Greek polis, the city-states. This was the place where people, where men would interact and have the very substance of the common life that constituted the political life. So in the agora, Socrates would come up to people and ask them questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? And in ways that sometimes, reading the dialogues that Plato has left us, we might even find ourselves being a little annoyed. Certainly his interlocutors would find themselves befuddled, because Socrates would not take very long before he would reveal that the person that he was conversing with didn't know as much as he thought he knew. So you think that justice is X. What about this? And then suddenly, we're not sure what justice is. That was Socrates' mission. His mission was to carry out the Delphic injunction, know thyself, and what he knew, and what supposedly the Delphic oracle praised him for knowing, was that he didn't know, that he was not actually someone in possession of a dogmatic truth that he could impart authoritatively to a world of disciples. That is, he was one of the few people, unlike, most of us again, we're pretty sure we know what's going on, what's right and wrong. And Socrates was always there to try to say, the things that we take for granted, we should keep thinking about. He may have started off as a natural philosopher. That is, ironically, Socrates may have started out as a PreSocratic kind of philosopher. That is, we've seen how from Thales on, this eruption of philosophy, starting in Ionia in Western Asia Minor, was a way of trying to inquire into the nature of reality in a mode that was different from mythology, from what Homer was doing, for instance. It was a way of trying to understand the causality of the world through a kind of a logical inquiry. But it was mostly focused on the order of natural process. And it seems as if Socrates may have started out as a natural philosopher. This would make sense of his presentation, his being presented in The Clouds by Aristophanes as this man who wanted to measure the distance of flea jumps, for instance. In the Phaedo, he says he has a second sailing, and he switches to human affairs. Ethics and politics is his focus. And Cicero has this very beautiful statement in the Tusculan Disputations where he says, Socrates called philosophy down from heaven and placed it in cities, and introduced it even in homes, and drove it to inquire about life and customs and things good and evil. And that is really the remarkable pivot that Socrates effects in this project of philosophy. So the pre-Socratics were not uninterested in justice. We hear about that. We know with the Anaximander fragment, somehow the cosmic process is related to decay, to justice, and all of that. But there was something definitive about the way that Socrates would shift our attention in philosophy to ethics and politics. What is justice would be kind of the central question. What is good? What really is good for me and you? Is it good to be wealthy? Is it good to inflict suffering rather than to endure suffering? What is good? And such questions. He wanted to facilitate a perfection of the soul and to pursue the truth in a common conversation. And so even if he was seen by a democracy that was traumatized, remember that 399 was just a few years after the end of the Peloponnesian War, which was the great defeat of Athens by Sparta in 404 BC. We've indicated the trajectory of this great city, Athens, one of the greatest cities in the history of the world in this century, after the defeat of the Persians in 480, 470, 479. We have the great age of Pericles, the switch to a radical democracy, but also, of course, always dependent on slavery and on an empire that Athens had, in the name of fighting for Greek liberty, had in fact compromised Greek liberty. And so it seems like a great tragedy to see this great city, which, because of its wealth gained through imperial means, drew all of these creative minds to itself. The sophists came, great artists came. When a city has a lot of money, people come. Well, that caused the Golden Age, but also caused this hubris that led Athens into a disastrous war with Sparta. That ended up in 404 with Sparta's placing an oligarchic regime over Athens, what it became known as the 30 Tyrants, who executed hundreds of people in a reign of terror. Socrates, in fact, refused to go along with one of these executions when he was called to do so. It's a little too easy to say that Socrates was an opponent of democracy. It seems to me that at a very profound level, he was one of the great bearers of the democratic ethos, but in the sense that he was doing this project in the agora of saying we all need to talk together and to pursue the truth together. However that may be, the democratic, reconstituted democracy after the 30 Tyrants was traumatized and found Socrates' pursuit of the truth dangerous. It destabilized traditional piety. The gods of the city seemed to be under assault by his questions. And he seemed to be drawing away the young. And part of this we'll talk about in the future had to do with his relationship to Alcibiades, a very strange figure. But that's a story we can leave for a later time. So this reconstituted democracy in 399 executes Socrates. Plato at that point leaves Athens. He's from aristocratic lineage from both mother and father. And he leaves Athens for southern Italy, Magna Graecia. He clearly has contact with Parmenidean thought and with Pythagorean thought. And he comes back in the 380s to establish the first, research institute. I mean, it's clearly the predecessor of what we think of as university life. And this is the academy, which met in a grove sacred to a hero called Academos outside the city. And this is one of the great cooperative ventures in the history of thought, because now we have argument being carried on, dialectic, that is discussion about, vigorous back and forth discussion, thinking about the great things. So the question is a philosopher supposed to sit up front and hold forth in front of a class of pupils, disciples? Or is Plato still Socratic enough to say that the philosopher isn't really a guru, isn't there to give a doctrine, a dogma? Socrates clearly rejected that notion of a philosopher, and I do believe that Plato also rejected that notion. That's why I believe that he engaged in the dialogue form, which was a unique genre, something he creates. He doesn't go the route of myth with writing in dactylic hexameters. He doesn't go the route of aphorisms. He doesn't write prose the way Herodotus writes it. He does a dramatic work. It is prose, but it's full of drama. And you can't really assign his thought to one speaker in the dialogue, even if often the main character is Socrates. The main dramatic character in these dialogues is often Socrates. The truth that Plato may be trying to reach for is in the dramatic whole. That's just basic to a literary treatment of a literary form. He certainly has things, it seems, that he wants to communicate, but it's being communicated aslant, and that's essential. That is, he's not holding forth the way Parmenides does in dactylic hexameters, or the way that Heraclitus does in aphorisms. He's doing it through dialogue. So that's one of the great questions that we have, whether there's a continuing Socratic perplexity, puzzlement that goes through Socrates' Plato's dialogues, or whether there's a positive teaching. We have all the works that antiquity thought of as Plato's in the canon of Thrasyllus, who was a 1st century AD Alexandrian thinker. He divided the 35 dialogues plus the letters as one into 9 tetralogies, seemingly to give a kind of parallel to the tragedians and the trilogy plus the satyr play, the tetralogies that they would have. Modern scholars have tended to divide the works of Plato into 3 general groupings: early, middle, late. The early being Socratic dialogues. Clearly, it seems like the way Socrates would have conducted his explorations in the Agora. With the middle dialogues, including the Great Republic, we have what scholars call the theory of forms, which is supposedly one of the positive teachings that Plato is trying to communicate that wouldn't have been in Socrates. And then we have the late dialogues of the Philebus, the Laws, the Timaeus, the Critias, the Sophist, and the Statesman, which those clearly are late because of the stylometric reasons. We can actually group them in. The Laws was left unfinished, so that one is secure. The others, though, we can't really have a hard and fast grouping. The fact is, we don't know what order those are written in, and we usually make decisions about how to order them based on kind of a philosophical preconception. That's part of the point, though. Do we think that Plato was becoming less and less Socratic as he went on, becoming more and more of a guru that had a doctrine to teach? Or in fact, was he still always a Socratic? And that's what I believe, that he was always Socratic. One of his successors as head of the academy, Arcesilaus, in the 3rd century BC, about a century after its founding, founded what we call now the New Academy. He rejected dogmatic teaching, and he was claiming that that was in fact the way Plato ran the academy, that it was a place that you could have Aristotle as one of the students along with Plato himself. I mean, you could have different views because it wasn't a school in the sense of having a school opinion. His great antagonist, Arcesilaus' great antagonist, was actually the founder of the Stoics, Zeno of Citium. And then a couple of centuries later, in the 1st century BC, we have Antiochus of Ascalon asserting a positive teaching of the Platonists. That's what we call the beginning of Middle Platonism, and that would go on into Neoplatonism. That is a very systematic body of Platonic doctrine, so-called. And I think there's a lot of beautiful things to be said about those thinkers, but the question is, fundamentally, is the truth something that we can tie up into a neat system? That certainly wouldn't be Socratic, and the question for us is, was Plato Socratic all the way through? Is philosophy Socratic? Is it, other thinkers later on would continue to be moved by this notion. Kierkegaard being one of the great followers, thinking the point is not to sit there and tell another person, this is the way it is. The point is both of us in a great conversation asking, how should we live? In a humble way, in a way that's open always to correction, always alive to the energy of thinking.